The phone rang just once before I picked it up, and that was when I knew my life was about to split cleanly in two. It was late afternoon, that quiet hour when the house feels like it's holding its breath. The dishwasher hummed low in the kitchen, and the clock over the stove ticked so loud it made my temples ache. I had been folding towels on the couch, the warm cotton still smelling faintly of lavender detergent, when the landline rang. We hardly ever used it anymore. Mostly telemarketers and doctors' offices called that number. I answered without thinking. "Hello?" There was a pause. Just a breath. Then a woman's voice, steady, practiced, not at all nervous. "Hi, is Mark home?" She said his name like she knew it well, like it lived comfortably in her mouth. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at the beige wall across from me, at the faint scuff near the light switch that I'd meant to paint over for years. My heart began to beat too loudly, thudding against my ribs. "He's not," I finally said. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone older. "Can I take a message?" Another pause, this one longer. I heard the faint sound of traffic behind her, a car horn, the world moving on like nothing was wrong. "Oh," she said softly, "that's okay. I'll try his cell again." And then she hung up. I sat there with the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead line buzz. The towels slid from my lap to the floor, one by one, but I didn't notice. All I could hear was the echo of her voice, calm, familiar, certain. Because just 2 nights earlier, my husband had stood in this very room and told me his phone had been hacked. Before all of this, my life wasn't perfect, but it was settled. That's the word I'd use. Settled like a house that's finally stopped creaking after years of adjusting to the ground beneath it. Mark and I had been married for 22 years, long enough that people stopped asking how we met and started assuming we'd always been together. We had routines instead of dates, shared jokes instead of arguments. On Sunday mornings, he made eggs too soft and toast too dark, and I pretended not to notice. On weeknights, we sat side by side on the couch, watching different shows on the same screen, our shoulders touching like punctuation at the end of a sentence. We weren't young anymore, but we were comfortable. Our children were grown and scattered, one across the state, one 2 time zones away. The house felt larger now, quieter. I filled the space with habits, watering the plants every Wednesday, baking banana bread when the bananas turned black, keeping the landline because it felt wrong to let it go. Mark worked long hours in logistics, a job that came with late calls and constant emails. I worked part-time at the library, shelving books, breathing in that old paper smell that always made me feel calm. We waved goodbye to each other in the mornings without ceremony, kissed goodnight out of habit. That's why the first message didn't make sense. It came on a Tuesday evening while we were eating leftovers at the kitchen counter. Mark's phone buzzed once, face down beside his plate. He didn't reach for it. I didn't look at it. Phones buzz all the time. That's the world we live in. But then it buzzed again, and again. Mark frowned, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and finally flipped the phone over. I wasn't trying to see, but the screen lit up bright enough that the reflection caught on the microwave door. A woman's name, not one I recognized. He turned the phone face down so quickly the chair scraped the floor. "Spam," he said too fast. "Some scam thing." I nodded. I always nodded. Trust had become muscle memory. Later that night, when he was in the shower, the phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I glanced at it without thinking. Another message. Same name. This time a preview flashed before the screen dimmed. "Did you get home safe?" I told myself a dozen stories in the space of a breath. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was a group chat gone wrong. Maybe it was nothing. Mark came out of the bathroom with steam clinging to his skin and a towel around his waist. He saw me holding the phone and stopped short. "What's that?" he asked, his voice tight. "It keeps buzzing," I said evenly. "Whose?" He took the phone from my hand, his fingers brushing mine. "It's nothing," he said, already scrolling. "I think my phone's been hacked." "Hacked?" I repeated, tasting the word. It felt flimsy. "Yeah," he said, already scrolling. "Some phishing thing. They clone numbers, send weird messages. I'm dealing with it." He kissed my forehead like he always did, quick and distracted. "Don't worry about it." And I didn't. Or rather, I tried not to. Over the next few days, the messages multiplied. He stopped leaving his phone on the counter. He took it with him to the bathroom. He silenced it at night. When I asked questions, he answered patiently, almost kindly, as if I were a child confused by technology. "Trust me," he said once, squeezing my hand. "You know me." I did know him, or I thought I did. That's what made the landline call feel like a crack in the foundation. Not loud, not dramatic, just sudden enough to make everything shift. After she hung up, I sat there for a long time. The clock ticked, the dishwasher clicked as it finished its cycle. Outside, a neighbor laughed, the sound drifting through an open window. I replayed the call again and again in my head, the way she hadn't asked for him by last name, the way she'd said she'd try his cell again, like that was the natural next step. When Mark came home that evening, I was at the stove stirring a pot of soup I didn't remember starting. He kissed my cheek, hung his keys on the hook by the door. "Quiet day?" he asked, watching the carrots swirl in the broth. "Someone called," I said, watching the carrots swirl in the broth. "Who?" I turned to face him. "A woman. Asked for you." He didn't flinch. Not at first. Then I saw it, the smallest tightening around his eyes, like a door closing. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice carefully. "That you weren't home." And, his voice was careful now, "and she said she'd try your cell again." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Mark set his briefcase down slowly, too slowly. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "that settles it. Definitely hacked." I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the man I'd shared a bed with for 2 decades, at the faint gray at his temples, at the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Something inside me went very still. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of his chest. Somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, I realized I didn't believe him anymore. And once that door opens, even just a crack, there's no closing it again. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the way you do when your mind has been running all night without you. The house was still dark, the early light barely seeping through the blinds. Mark lay beside me on his back, one arm flung over the pillow where my shoulder usually rested. His mouth was slightly open, a soft snore escaping every few breaths. I watched him for a long time. There was a time when that face had felt like home, when I could read his moods by the set of his jaw, when the lines around his eyes told me whether he'd had a good day or a bad one. That morning, all I saw was a stranger wearing a familiar shape. I slid out of bed quietly and padded into the kitchen. The floor was cold under my feet. I made coffee I didn't want, just for the comfort of the ritual. The scoop of grounds, the gurgle of the machine, the smell filling the room like a promise everything was still normal. At the table, I opened the drawer where we kept old bills and instruction manuals. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, proof maybe, or permission to stop trusting. Mark's phone was locked, of course, it always had been. That had never bothered me before. Privacy was something we respected in our marriage, or so I thought. When he came into the kitchen, already dressed for work, I was staring at my coffee, watching the steam curl up and disappear. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." He shrugged, poured himself a cup, and leaned against the counter. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing, the weather, a package that hadn't arrived yet, what to make for dinner. It all felt rehearsed, like lines we'd said too many times to remember why. As he reached for his keys, I asked, "What's her name?" He froze, just for a second, but it was enough. "Who?" he said, too quickly. "The woman who called yesterday." He let out a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "I told you there is no woman. It's a scam." "Then why did she sound like she knew you?" I asked. My voice surprised me, steady, almost calm. "She probably knows my name from somewhere. LinkedIn, Facebook, these people are clever." I nodded, again, trust out of habit. After he left, the house felt different. Not empty, wrong, like furniture had been moved in the night and I kept bumping into sharp corners where there hadn't been any before. I went to work and shelved books with shaking hands, titles blurred together. A young couple whispered to each other in the history section, their heads bent close, and I felt something sharp twist in my chest. At lunch, I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, my phone resting heavy in my lap. I thought about calling the number that had come up on the landline, but it hadn't shown a number, just unknown caller. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in my marriage. I waited. I left work early and sat in my car down the street from our house, watching the driveway. Mark wasn't due home for another hour. I told myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid, but my hands stayed on the wheel, my eyes on the road. At 4:37 p.m., his car pulled in. He didn't come inside right away. He stayed in the driver's seat, phone in hand, typing. I watched him through the windshield, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When he finally got out, he looked around before locking the car. Just a quick glance, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I waited until he was inside before pulling up behind him. That evening, he was attentive, too attentive. He asked about my day, offered to cook, poured me a glass of wine I didn't ask for. His eyes kept flicking to his phone, lighting up on the counter like a small, accusing star. After dinner, while he washed dishes, I sat at the table and made a decision. If his phone had been hacked, then there would be proof, emails from the carrier, password reset alerts, something. "Can I see your phone?" I asked as casually as I could. He stiffened. "Why?" "So I can help you figure out the hacking thing," I said. "I might not know much about technology, but I know enough to look for warning signs." He dried his hands slowly, buying time. "It's handled. I don't want to mess with it right now." "Mark," I said, "please." For a long moment, he just stood there, his back to the sink, the dish cowl clutched in his hands. When he finally handed me the phone, it felt heavier than it should have. "Don't start reading things out of context," he warned. The phone was unlocked. That in itself felt strange. I opened the Messages app. There were dozens of threads, work, family, friends. Everything looked ordinary at first glance. My pulse slowed just a little. Then I saw it, the same name I'd seen before, not buried, pinned to the top. My fingers trembled as I tapped it. The last message was from that afternoon. "Miss you already. Today was perfect." My vision narrowed like the world was closing in around the edges. I scrolled up, my breath coming shallow. There were weeks of messages, months, casual jokes, complaints about work, photos, inside references I didn't understand but knew were intimate. "Who is this?" I whispered. Mark sat down across from me heavily like his legs had given out. "It's not what you think," he said. I laughed then, a short, broken sound. "Don't," I said, "just don't." He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. His face crumpled, the mask finally slipping. "She doesn't mean anything," he said. "It just happened." "When?" I asked. He swallowed. "Last year." I closed my eyes. Images flooded in uninvited, family holidays, quiet nights, the way he'd held my hand at my mother's funeral, all of it stained now. "And the hacking?" I asked. He looked down at the floor. I panicked. I stood up so suddenly my chair scraped loudly against the tile. She called this house, I said, my voice rising despite myself. She called our landline, Mark. He looked up sharply. What? She called yesterday and asked for your name, and you stood there and lied to my face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in our marriage, he had nothing to say. That night, we slept in separate rooms. I lay awake in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned, over and over, like time refusing to move forward. Somewhere in the dark, his phone buzzed. I didn't need to see it to know who it was. Morning came without mercy. The light crept in through the guest room curtains, pale and indifferent, illuminating the unfamiliar ceiling above me. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all rushed back. The messages, the name pinned to the top of his phone, the calm voice on the landline asking for my husband like she belonged here. I lay still, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. No clatter of dishes, no radio murmuring the morning news. When I finally got up, my body felt heavy, like I was moving underwater. I padded down the hallway, every step measured, careful, as if the wrong sound might break something fragile that still hadn't fully shattered. Mark was already gone. His side of the bed was cold. His mug was missing from the drying rack. On the counter, he'd left a note written in the hurried block letters I knew so well. Went in early. We'll talk later. I'm sorry. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the junk drawer where we kept rubber bands and old batteries. Somehow, it felt fitting. At work, I smiled at patrons and stamped return dates with mechanical precision. Inside, my thoughts ran wild, circling the same questions over and over. Who was she? How long had she felt entitled to call my home? What stories had he told her about me? That afternoon, my phone rang. My cell this time. Unknown number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. A minute later, it rang again. My chest tightened, but I answered. Hello? There was no hesitation this time. Hi, the woman said. I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this. I sat down slowly on the edge of my desk chair. You already did, I said, yesterday. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I didn't know it was a landline, she said finally. I thought I was calling his cell. That makes it better? I asked quietly. No, it doesn't. I closed my eyes. Why are you calling me? She took a breath. I could hear it, shaky this time. Because he won't answer me, and because I think you deserve to hear it from me. Hear what? My fingers curled into my palm. That you didn't know he was still this married, she said. He told me you were separated. Of course he did. I pictured her now, somewhere else, maybe sitting in a car or pacing a living room that wasn't mine. She sounded younger than me. Not young, but not weathered by years of compromise and forgiveness either. How long? I asked. There it was again, that pause, the breath. Almost a year, she said. A year, a full cycle of holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. Did you know about me at all? I asked. Yes, she said softly. He talked about you, about the house, your kids. I thought you'd already moved on. I almost laughed. Instead, a tear slipped down my cheek and landed on my hand. You called my home. You asked for him like you belonged there. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't think. No, I said, you didn't. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not with anger, something colder, clearer. That evening, when Mark came home, I was waiting for him at the kitchen table. His face looked tired, lined in ways I didn't remember noticing before. "She called me," I said. He stopped short. "Who?" "You know who." He sat down slowly, like the weight of the truth had finally pressed him into the chair. "What did she say?" "That you told her we were separated, that she didn't know you were still fully married." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." "But it did. It got far enough that she felt comfortable calling my house." He looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed. "I never meant to hurt you." I studied him carefully, the man who'd built a second life in the cracks of the first. "But you did," I said. "Every day you chose not to stop." We talked for hours that night, or maybe we talked around each other. He cried, he apologized, he said words like mistake and confused and lonely. I listened. I asked questions I didn't really want the answers to. When it was over, nothing felt resolved, just exposed. In the days that followed, the truth seeped into the corners of my life. I told my sister first, her sharp intake of breath loud in my ear, then my closest friend who came over with soup and sat beside me on the couch, holding my hand while I stared at nothing. Mark moved into the guest room. He said he wanted to fix things, that he'd ended it, that he'd do whatever it took. I told him I needed time. What I didn't tell him was that time had already started doing its work. With every quiet morning, every untouched side of the bed, I felt something shifting, not breaking, settling. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old paperwork, the landline rang again. My heart jumped, but when I answered, it was just a dentist's office confirming an appointment. I hung up and stood there for a long moment staring at the phone. That was when I realized something important. The call that had shattered my illusion had also given me clarity. The lie hadn't just been about an affair, it had been about my place in my own life, and I was done living in the dark. That night, I told Mark I wanted separation. Not yelling, not drama, just truth spoken plainly. He nodded slowly, like he'd known it was coming. Sometimes the loudest consequences are the quiet ones. Separation doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces. It came first with the toothbrush he carried down the hall, bristles still damp, and the way he avoided my eyes as he placed it in the guest bathroom. It came with the sound of his alarm going off earlier than mine, the soft click of the door as he left for work before I was fully awake. It came in the space that opened between us at the dinner table, an empty chair that seemed to grow louder each night. People think the moment you ask for separation is explosive, that there are slammed doors and raised voices and ultimatums, but ours was quiet, heavy, like a storm that had already passed, leaving behind soaked ground and broken branches you didn't notice until you tried to walk through it. Mark tried, in his way. He cooked dinner some nights and left it warming in the oven for me, covered carefully with foil. He texted to ask if I'd eaten. He apologized again and again, his words worn thin from repetition. I didn't respond much, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I was listening to myself for the first time in years. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of him. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what's fair." I hung my coat on the back of the chair and sat across from him. "Fair doesn't feel like the right word," I said. He nodded. "I know, but I want you to know I'm not trying to take anything from you." The papers were bank statements, mortgage documents, things we'd built together, line by line. "We'll do this properly," he said, "however you want." I studied his face, the familiar lines, the eyes that had once felt like shelter. I believed he meant it. That was the strange part. I believed him now more than I had in the months leading up to the landline call, because the lies were over. Word spread slowly, the way it always does in quiet communities, not with shouting, but with raised eyebrows and lowered voices. A neighbor asked if Mark had moved out. A friend from church squeezed my hand a little too tightly and said she was there if I needed anything. I didn't tell many people details. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of standing on its own. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I recognized now. "I hope you're okay," it read. I ended things completely. I didn't know how to apologize without making it worse. "I'm sorry." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "I believe you. Please don't contact me again." She replied almost immediately, "I understand." And that was it. I expected to feel triumphant or angry or vindicated. Instead, I felt something like release, a knot loosening. The public consequence didn't come in the form of gossip or humiliation. It came in smaller ways. Mark stopped being invited to certain gatherings. Mutual friends chose sides quietly. At work, he took a leave of absence for personal reasons. At home, I reclaimed space. I moved my favorite chair closer to the window. I painted over the scuff on the wall near the light switch. I replaced the old towels, the same ones that had slipped from my lap when the landline rang, with new ones in a soft, hopeful blue. One Saturday morning, I unplugged the landline. I stood there holding the cord, feeling its weight in my hand. For years, I'd kept it out of nostalgia, out of habit. It had been the voice that broke my marriage open, but it had also been the voice that forced me to see the truth. I set the phone in a box in the garage. Mark and I met with a mediator a few weeks later. We sat across from each other in a neutral room with beige walls and a box of tissues on the table. We spoke calmly. We listened. We divided things not by anger, but by history. When it was over, he lingered by the door. "I never meant for you to find out like that," he replied. "There's no good way to find out, but there is a right way to live after." He nodded, eyes shining. "I hope one day you can forgive me. I hope one day you forgive yourself." And I meant it. The healing didn't come all at once either. It came in quiet victories, sleeping through the night, laughing without guilt, planning a future that didn't require compromise I no longer wanted to make. Some evenings I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of the neighborhood. The world hadn't ended, it had simply changed. And in that change, I found something unexpected: peace. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes after everything has been said. Not the awkward silence of unfinished arguments or the brittle quiet of resentment, but a deeper stillness, the kind that settles in when there's nothing left to explain or defend. That was the quiet that began to fill my days after the paperwork was signed and the routines were no longer shared. Mark moved into a small apartment across town. I didn't go with him to see it. I didn't need to. The life we'd built together had already been reduced to memories and legal language. Seeing the new walls wouldn't have helped me grieve or heal. It would have only blurred the lines I was finally learning to draw. The house, though, it changed. At first, I thought it would feel hollow without him. Too big, too quiet. But slowly it began to feel like mine in a way it hadn't for years. I opened windows I'd always kept shut because he didn't like drafts. I rearranged the kitchen so the things I used most were within easy reach. I played music in the evenings, soft at first, then louder as my confidence returned. One afternoon, I caught myself humming while washing dishes. The sound startled me. It had been so long since joy had arrived unannounced. People asked how I was doing, some with genuine concern, others with the careful politeness reserved for broken things. I learned to answer honestly without oversharing. "I'm finding my footing," I'd say, and I was. I went back to the library full-time, picking up extra hours. The familiar rhythm of shelving books, helping patrons find what they were looking for, brought me comfort. Stories had always been my refuge. Now they were my reminder that endings could also be beginnings. One evening, while closing up, a woman around my age lingered by the counter. She hesitated, then said quietly, "I heard about your situation." I braced myself, ready for pity. Instead, she smiled gently. "I just wanted to say you handled it with a lot of grace." Her words followed me home like a warm coat. Grace. I hadn't felt graceful. I'd felt wounded, lost, angry at times. But maybe grace isn't the absence of pain. Maybe it's choosing not to let pain turn you into someone you don't recognize. The hardest moments came unexpectedly. At the grocery store, reaching for his favorite cereal out of habit. At night, when something funny happened on television and I turned to share it before remembering I was alone. Grief isn't loud. It's sneaky. It waits for your guard to drop. But even in those moments, I noticed something else. I wasn't questioning myself anymore. I wasn't replaying conversations, wondering if I'd imagined things, if I'd been too sensitive, too suspicious. The clarity that had come with the truth stayed with me, solid, steady. One Sunday afternoon, my daughter called. "Mom," she said gently, "how are you really?" I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the wood. "I'm okay," I said. Then, after a pause, "I'm more than okay. I'm learning who I am without shrinking." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm proud of you." Those words mattered more than she knew. Months passed, seasons shifted. The trees outside my window changed color and then shed their leaves. I found comfort in the predictability of it all. Life continued with or without betrayal. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in the garage, I found the landline phone. It was wrapped in a towel, tucked away like something fragile. I sat on the concrete floor and held it in my lap, running my thumb over the buttons worn smooth by years of use. That phone had delivered the moment my life cracked open, but it hadn't caused the break. It had only revealed what was already there. I carried it to the curb the next morning, setting it gently inside the recycling bin. When the truck came and lifted it away, I felt lighter than I expected. Letting go doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as deciding you no longer need to keep what hurt you. Mark and I spoke occasionally, brief and practical conversations about shared responsibilities that hadn't fully unraveled yet. He respected my boundaries. I respected my healing. Once he said, "You seem stronger." I considered that. "I think I'm just clearer," I replied. He nodded. There was regret in his eyes, not the kind that asks for forgiveness, but the kind that understands it may never come. And that was okay. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't something you owe. It's something you offer when and if it serves your peace. As for me, I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to expose him or shame him publicly. The truth had done enough. It had rearranged our lives, stripped away illusions, and handed each of us our consequences. Mine was freedom. Now, when the phone rings, I answer without fear. When silence fills the house, it feels restful, not lonely. I trust my instincts in a way I once talked myself out of. And sometimes, late in the evening, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about how easily I might have believed the hacking story forever, how easily I might have stayed. But the truth has a way of finding its voice. For me, it came through a landline I almost disconnected years ago, and it gave me my life back. There are nights now when I sit in the quiet and replay everything. Not with pain, but with curiosity. I think about how many small moments led up to that one phone call. How many times I felt something shift inside me and told myself it was nothing. How many times I chose peace over truth, not realizing that peace built on denial is only temporary shelter. For a long time, I thought strength meant endurance, staying, making things work no matter the cost. I grew up believing that good women hold families together, that loyalty is proven by silence, that doubt is a character flaw. I carried those beliefs into my marriage like heirlooms, never questioning whether they still fit. That's the thing about long relationships. They don't usually end because of one big explosion. They erode quietly, in missed glances, in half-truths, in the growing distance you learn to step over without noticing the gap getting wider. If I'm honest, the affair didn't surprise me as much as I thought it would. Hurt me? Yes. Shattered me for a while? Absolutely. But surprised me? No. Somewhere deep down, my body had already known. The sleepless nights, the unease I couldn't name, the way my chest tightened every time his phone buzzed. Our instincts keep records long before our minds are ready to read them. What surprised me was how long I'd ignored myself. When Mark said his phone was hacked, part of me wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. Belief would have meant safety, continuity, familiarity. Truth meant upheaval. Truth meant loss. And so I stood at that crossroads and almost chose the lie, not because I was foolish, but because I was tired. I know some of you listening understand that tiredness, the kind that settles into your bones after years of compromise, the kind that whispers, just let it go, it's easier this way. But ease is not the same as peace. Real peace is solid. It doesn't tremble when questions are asked. It doesn't require you to doubt your own memory or intuition. It doesn't ask you to shrink yourself so someone else can remain comfortable. That phone call didn't just expose my husband's betrayal, it exposed how disconnected I had become from my own voice. And reclaiming that voice, that was the real work. After the separation, people praised my calm. They told me I was handling it so well. What they didn't see were the nights I cried quietly so I wouldn't wake the neighbors, the mornings I sat on the edge of the bed trying to remember who I was outside of being someone's wife. Healing is not graceful behind closed doors. It's messy and lonely and slow. But it's also honest. There's a kind of relief that comes when you stop negotiating with reality, when you stop asking, why wasn't I enough, and start asking, why did I accept less than honesty? That shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens in increments, through boundaries, through solitude, through choosing not to explain yourself to people who benefit from your confusion. I don't tell my story because I want sympathy. I tell it because I know how isolating betrayal can feel, how it convinces you that you're alone in your experience, that your pain is somehow unique or shameful. It isn't. Infidelity doesn't just break trust, it fractures identity. It makes you question your judgment, your memories, your worth. And rebuilding from that requires more than forgiveness. It requires clarity. One of the hardest lessons I learned is that closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, the quiet kind. Accepting that someone you loved chose deception, accepting that you may never understand all their reasons, accepting that not every ending provides answers that satisfy the heart. But acceptance doesn't mean excusing. It means releasing yourself from the burden of carrying someone else's guilt. I also learned that boundaries can feel cruel to people who benefited from your lack of them. When I stopped explaining myself, when I stopped softening my needs to protect Mark's feelings, there were moments he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. In a way, he was right. I was becoming someone new, someone who no longer negotiated her reality. That transformation wasn't loud. It didn't come with declarations or ultimatums. It came in choices. Choosing not to answer late-night messages, choosing not to revisit old arguments, choosing not to reassure someone who had already broken my trust. There is power in quiet resolve, and there is dignity in walking away without turning your pain into a spectacle. I didn't need revenge. Life handled the consequences better than I ever could. The loss of respect, the fractured relationships, the weight of knowing he traded honesty for temporary comfort. Those are not punishments I needed to deliver. They arrived on their own. My role was to survive with my integrity intact. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something that feels confusing or heavy, I want you to hear this clearly. Confusion is not love. Anxiety is not passion, and loyalty should never cost you your sense of self. If someone tells you a story that requires you to silence your intuition, pay attention. If your peace depends on not asking questions, that peace is already compromised. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to leave. And leaving doesn't always mean physically walking away. Sometimes it means emotionally detaching from a narrative that no longer serves you. Sometimes it means choosing yourself in small, consistent ways until one day you realize you're standing on solid ground again. I am not bitter. I am not hardened. I am clearer. I still believe in love. I believe in partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. I believe people can grow and change, but I also believe that love without truth is not love, it's performance. The life I have now is quieter, simpler, more intentional. I know myself better. I trust my instincts. I no longer apologize for discomfort that comes from asking for honesty. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer mistake endurance for strength. Strength is listening when something feels wrong. Strength is choosing clarity over comfort. Strength is walking forward without needing permission. So I'll leave you with this question, not to judge yourself, not to rush a decision, but simply to reflect. If the truth knocked on your door today, would you answer it? If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something you haven't been able to name yet, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone because you spoke up. There is a version of me who still remembers the exact weight of that phone in my hand. Not the cell phone, the landline receiver. Heavy, solid, old-fashioned. The kind of thing that makes you aware you're holding something real. Sometimes I think that's why the moment landed the way it did. It wasn't a text I could reread and reinterpret. It wasn't a notification I could swipe away. It was a human voice reaching into my home, speaking my husband's name like it belonged to her. That weight stayed with me long after the phone was gone. For a while, I carried it in my chest, in my shoulders, in the way I hesitated before answering any call, even from people I loved. Trauma doesn't always announce itself as panic. Sometimes it shows up as caution, as hyper-awareness, as the quiet question of what else don't I know? And that question can either consume you or wake you up. I won't pretend the aftermath was noble or enlightened every single day. There were moments when I missed him terribly. Not the man he had become, but the man I thought he was. The one I laughed with in grocery store aisles. The one who used to rub my back absent-mindedly while watching television. Grief has a way of blurring timelines, of making you mourn people who no longer exist. I had to learn to grieve honestly, not just the marriage, but the future I'd assumed would unfold naturally, the shared retirement plans, the inside jokes that wouldn't make sense to anyone else, the comfort of a familiar presence in the house, even on days we barely spoke. Letting go of that future hurt more than confronting the betrayal itself. Because betrayal is sharp, it cuts quickly, but grief is dull, it lingers, it settles in corners and waits for quiet moments to remind you of what you lost. What surprised me was that alongside the grief, something else began to grow. Respect for myself. For the woman who finally listened when her intuition spoke, for the woman who didn't scream or beg or unravel publicly, even though she had every reason to. For the woman who chose truth over convenience, even when truth cost her comfort. That respect didn't arrive all at once. It came gradually, built through small acts of self-trust. saying no without explanation, choosing rest over obligation, allowing silence without rushing to fill it. I used to think confidence came from being chosen, from being loved consistently, visibly, without question. Now I know confidence comes from choosing yourself when love turns conditional or deceptive. And that lesson, that quiet, hard-earned lesson, is something no one can take from me. I've been asked more than once if I'd ever take Mark back, if I'd ever reconsider. The question usually comes from people who are uncomfortable with endings, who believe time automatically repairs what betrayal breaks. My answer is always gentle but firm. No. Not because I hate him, not because I want him to suffer, but because the version of myself who accepted less than honesty no longer exists, and I will not betray her by returning to something that required me to doubt my own reality. That's something I want you to hear clearly if you're listening from a place of confusion or fear. Moving on doesn't require anger. It requires alignment with your values, with your truth, with the life you want to inhabit going forward. There is a difference between forgiveness and access. You can forgive someone and still refuse to let them back into the parts of your life they mishandled. That distinction changed everything for me. In the quiet of my new routines, I've had time to reflect on how often women are taught to absorb discomfort, to keep the peace, to smooth things over, to stay quiet so others don't feel ashamed or exposed. We are praised for our patience, our resilience, our ability to hold things together. But no one talks enough about the cost of swallowing your doubts, the cost of minimizing your instincts, the cost of carrying emotional labor for someone who is actively betraying you. Those costs add up. They show up in your body, in your sleep, in the way you start apologizing for questions you have every right to ask. I don't want that life anymore, and I don't want it for you either. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it's that truth does not destroy strong relationships. Lies do. Questions don't end marriages. Deception does. And clarity, even when it hurts, is a form of kindness to yourself. Some days I still think about the woman who called. I don't hate her. I don't romanticize her either. She was a symptom, not the cause. A participant in a story built on half-truths and convenient omissions. What I feel toward her now is distance, emotional neutrality, the kind that tells me I've healed enough to not need villains anymore. The real turning point wasn't the discovery of the affair. It was the moment I stopped centering my healing around his remorse and started centering it around my own well-being. That's when things truly shifted. I started asking different questions, not why did he do this to me, but what do I need now? Not how do I make sense of this, but how do I take care of myself today? Those questions are grounding. They pull you out of the rumination and back into the present moment where healing actually happens. And healing, I've learned, is not about forgetting, it's about integrating the truth without letting it define you. This experience is part of my story, but it is not the whole story. I am more than the woman who was lied to. I am more than the marriage that ended. I am more than the phone call that changed everything. I am a woman who learned to listen, a woman who chose clarity, a woman who trusted herself back into wholeness. If you're still here, listening, maybe part of you recognizes yourself in my words. Maybe you're standing at the edge of a truth you've been avoiding. Maybe you're already living in the aftermath of one. Wherever you are, I want you to know this. You are not weak for wanting to believe someone. You are not foolish for hoping things will improve. And you are not wrong for needing proof when something doesn't feel right. Your intuition is not your enemy. It is your oldest ally. So before I end, I want to ask you something worth sitting with, not answering quickly. What truth have you been explaining away because facing it feels too disruptive? And what might happen if you trusted yourself enough to listen? If this story touched something in you, if it mirrored a feeling you've been carrying quietly, I invite you to share, only if you feel safe to do so. Sometimes naming our experiences is the first step towards reclaiming our power. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories told without shouting, without spectacle, but with honesty and heart, then I hope you'll stay, subscribe, listen, reflect with us, because your story matters too. And sometimes hearing someone else's truth helps us find our own. There is a kind of wisdom that only comes after everything familiar falls quiet. Not wisdom from books or advice or people telling you what you should do, but the kind that settles into your bones after you've lived through something that stripped you down to your essentials. That's where I am now. Not at the end of pain, but at the end of confusion. And there's a difference. Confusion keeps you tethered to the past. Clarity gives you permission to move forward. I didn't realize how much energy I had been spending trying to understand someone else's choices, turning them over in my mind like stones, hoping if I examined them long enough, they'd reveal something that made the betrayal hurt less. They never did, because some answers don't heal you, they just keep you stuck. The day I stopped asking why was the day my life began to feel lighter. That doesn't mean I stopped caring. It means I stopped negotiating with reality. There's a subtle but powerful shift that happens when you accept that someone you loved was capable of deceiving you. Not because you failed, not because you weren't enough, but because they made choices that aligned with their own needs, not your shared values. Accepting that truth doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. For a long time, I carried quiet shame about the whole thing. Shame that I hadn't noticed sooner, shame that I had believed him, shame that I had defended our marriage to people who saw cracks I wasn't ready to acknowledge. But here's what I know now. Trust is not a flaw. Loyalty is not naivete. Love given sincerely is never something to be embarrassed about. The shame was never mine to carry. If anything, what I feel now is pride. Pride in the woman who didn't collapse under the weight of betrayal. Pride in the woman who allowed herself to grieve fully without rushing toward forgiveness just to appear strong. Pride in the woman who chose dignity over drama, boundaries over bitterness. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like restraint. I didn't expose Mark publicly, I didn't retaliate, I didn't turn his mistakes into my identity, and while some people may think that means he got away with it, I see it differently. He didn't get away with anything. He lost a marriage built on history. He lost trust that can never be fully restored. He lost the version of me who once makes space for his comfort at her own expense. Those losses are quiet, but they are permanent. And me? I gained myself. I gained mornings where I don't second-guess my instincts. I gained evenings filled with peace instead of vigilance. I gained a deeper relationship with my own voice, the one I used to silence for the sake of harmony. Harmony built on silence is not harmony at all. There are moments still when memory sneaks up on me, a song from our early years, a restaurant we used to love, a phrase he used to say that no one else says quite the same way. Those moments sting, but they no longer wound. They pass. That's how I know I've healed. Healing doesn't mean the past disappears. It means the past no longer controls your present. One of the most unexpected gifts of this experience has been messages from women, some I know, many I don't, who quietly tell me, "Your story sounds like mine." Different details, different faces, same ache, same doubt, same moment of realization that something wasn't right. If that's you, if you're listening and feeling that ache, I want you to know you're not alone and you're not imagining things. You don't need proof worthy of a courtroom to trust your intuition. You don't need permission to question what feels off. And you don't need to wait for things to get worse before you decide you deserve honesty. You deserve honesty now. I also want to say this gently. Staying is not failure, and leaving is not success. The real measure is whether you are living in alignment with your truth. Some people rebuild, some people walk away. Both paths require courage. What matters is that the choice is made with open eyes. For me, leaving was the only way I could stay whole. I sometimes wonder who I would be now if the landline hadn't rung that day, if she hadn't called, if Mark's lie had held just a little longer. I might still be living in a house full of quiet tension, telling myself stories to explain my unease. And that thought, more than anything, reminds me why truth matters. Truth interrupts patterns that slowly erode us. Truth gives us a chance to choose differently. It doesn't always come gently, but it always comes honestly. Today, when I look ahead, my future feels open, not overwhelming, open. There's room for new experiences, new connections, new versions of joy I couldn't imagine when my world felt small and uncertain. I don't know exactly what the next chapter holds, and for the first time in a long time, I'm okay with that, because I trust myself to handle whatever comes next. That trust, that relationship with myself, is the real ending of this story. So, as I close, I want to leave you with one last thought to carry with you, especially if you're standing at the edge of a difficult truth. You don't need to become harder to survive betrayal. You don't need to lose your softness to gain strength. You only need to stop abandoning yourself. If you're listening late at night or early in the morning or in the quiet space between obligations and this story found you, maybe it found you for a reason. Take your time, be gentle with yourself, and listen closely to that small, steady voice inside you. It knows the way forward, even when the path feels uncertain. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Thank you for listening without judgment. And thank you for honoring your own truth, even if you're still learning how. If this story resonated with you, if it reflected a piece of your own journey, I invite you to share your thoughts or your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of truth, resilience, and quiet courage, please consider subscribing and staying with us. Because healing doesn't always happen alone. Sometimes it begins when we finally feel seen.